Good morning, Bob. Great to hear from you again this morning.
Morning, Chris, and it's nice to have these ongoing discussions. And I suppose over the months, it reflects the ups and downs and the moods we both find ourselves in, and how we view things at a particular point in time.
Well, look, and I think that's very valid because things are changing again, aren't they? And people are beginning to realise we're going to have to live with this.
Well, exactly, and I suppose my own views have changed as well. I mean, as someone says, if the facts change, you have to change your views. And I have to say, I now see that we have to live with the threat of pandemics, not just COVID-19 that we have at the moment, but new variants and perhaps further pandemics are going to be a feature of what we have to live with for the foreseeable future. And therefore, I think we have to come to terms with, looking at our business models and running our business with a view to it isn't going to go back to the way it was a year ago. The world definitely has changed and moved on, and we have to come to terms with that. So taking precautions and all the issues that we are currently dealing with, we have to think of this is with us for the long term.
And that's obviously going to impact on business models and the way we think about how we go about things, isn't it?
And I think, absolutely fundamentally, I suspect that hospitality is one of those sectors of the British economy where we will have to have a fundamental rethink, because the demand for food and drink and good service won't go away. There'll always be that demand, but it will be perhaps handled in a different way. The volumes will be different. There always will be demand, but we have to devise business models which can work profitably under these new circumstances.
I mean, it's also interesting about what we've got to try to work off in terms of expectation, because people still in their business models compared to 2019. But the reality,
well, I think that is half the problem at the moment. Is people are still, stuck in what their business model was, and they're still trying to sort of make changes around the edges to the fundamental business model on the basis that it will return. And I think we have to almost go back to square one in terms of this is what our core skills are, this is what our expertise is, this is what we're good at. How can we now construct a new business model for the foreseeable future under these new circumstances? So it's, back to square one and rethink the business model from basics and establish something that is robust for the future.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? And actually it's challenging, because most people expect 40% revenues against 2019, probably for this year, which makes everyone has to think very differently about their models. What do you think?
Well, exactly. And I think one of the problems we've had is that if we look back over the last 5, 10, 15 years, it's essentially been based on revenues growing year by year by year by year, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5%. It's a forever growing revenue model. So therefore, we built in costs to support the growing revenue model. And that's the model. It's based on forever growing revenues. Now I think we've got to go back to square one and construct the model based on what is our skills, what is our particular expertise, what are we particularly good at, what can we construct that demands, the right price and some demand, and construct a model based on that. And I've come round to the term that for the foreseeable future, I want businesses to focus on what I term localism. And that's for every business, really focus on a local approach. And what I mean by a local approach is, if you look at the fundamentals of your business, one is we need to recruit great people to be able to work in our businesses, and that labour is going to predominantly have to come from local sources. So contact your local school, contact your local colleges, connect with the local people to employ labour. It means changing your supply sources and changing your menus and changes so that you actually can source as much of your supply requirements locally as well. And thirdly, it means that your likely revenue sources for the foreseeable future are also going to come from local customers, not from tourists from overseas or long distance travel or whatever, but locally. So it's local food supply with local labour, local customers, and above all, therefore, that establishes the hospitality sector's role in a local society. And I think the spin-off effect, therefore, will have an impact on climate change locally, and we'll get a real value placed on what we do by local societies. And therefore, that's why I think localism, as I call it, is the way we have to think for the foreseeable future.
The impact of that is obviously wide-ranging, starting with the supply chain, isn't it?
Oh, it is, and that's what I say. I think we're already beginning to see it. I hear sort of comments coming in from the big supermarkets and the like, do we need to be buying guava fruit and pineapples and all the things that maybe we've been used to over the years? Perhaps for the time being, we're going to have to buy as much locally as we can, British produced, and that's going to be great for the farming sector as well, because it's going to actually reflect some of the Brexit issues that we're seeing emerge. But it's a whole shift of buying local produce, helping local suppliers, whether it's, as I say, the food sector, the farming sector, or even the distribution sector. It's going to be a much more local approach with you having a more local control of your supply sources.
So I suppose we play this through as we come out of this over the summer. The regions may have a relatively good summer because obviously the staycations are going to be bigger.
I would actually anticipate that post-April, where one can begin to see the economy opening up again, particularly for hospitality, I think rural regional businesses will have a strong summer. I am quite confident they'll have a strong summer. And I think I've said this to you in the past. I think it'll be no bad thing that investment will pour into rural and regional businesses, particularly in the hospitality sector, and there'll be a little bit of leveling up between hospitality businesses in city centres and those in rural regional areas. And I think rural regional areas have been somewhat starved of capital over the last 10, 15 years. Almost too much has poured into city centres with the big brands because it was seen as a safe investment. Now I think we'll see a lot of that investment pouring into rural regional businesses. And maybe some of the spare capacity in city centres, particularly hotels and maybe some food service sites, will have to seek alternative uses, quite frankly.
Well, that's the interesting piece, isn't it? How do the city centre hotels adapt? They're so used to a very different landscape and environment.
Well, it's going to be the owners of those properties, essentially, because nearly all restaurants in city centres are obviously leasehold. And in fact, nowadays, very few hotel operators in city centres actually own their properties. They're on management contracts. It's owned by property developers. So it's the owners of those properties who will be seeking alternative sites for them. Whether a lot of them will actually be converted into housing and accommodation and the like, where we have this vast shortage of housing in city centres. And maybe that's what we're going to see down the track, this change of use in city centres to reflect the changing need, and investment in the hospitality sector going into rural regional areas where there's going to be real demand.
And I guess there's going to be greater connection, if you like, relationships between local farmers, local suppliers, and the operation, cutting out the middleman, isn't it?
Absolutely that, and that is why I term why the benefit of this localism approach, because local areas will actually see the genuine role that hospitality does actually play to link in employment, supplying of food, service and amenity to local customers, and the role it does have to play in society. And I think sometimes that area has been overlooked in past, that hospitality is often the glue that can, as it were, make local areas work. I mean, I think places like Cornwall and those sort of places have always understood that tourism and hospitality was the glue that made places work, but I think we're going to see that on a much wider basis in rural and regional communities.
Yeah, really interesting. And obviously about recruitment is going to change as well, isn't it? Because people are going to have to employ local people again.
Well, exactly, and I think we have to say the industry has been very guilty in the last 10 years in terms of not developing its own staff, not encouraging local people to join the sector, because the view was it was quicker, cheaper and easier to bring staff in from Europe. There was a ready supply of skilled people wanting to come in from Europe, and that was the easy option, and we forgot about the links with local schools, local colleges, and actually local communities and the parents of those youngsters, because it's the parents who are often the key indicators, and we failed to actually explain to people the great opportunities in the hospitality industry so that it could be a first choice career for many people. So it's been a kick up the backside for the sector, hopefully, that is a very important thing to do. Get in touch with your local school, go and visit them, visit the local colleges, form close links so that you can show that you've got career opportunities for those people.
I mean, it's getting back to basics, isn't it? And having to work hard again. Things we took for granted.
Well, yes, and I think there is going to be some hard work, but there's nothing wrong with that. And those that actually put the effort in and put the thinking in will be the businesses that succeed, because there will be opportunity out there, and because, as I say, there will be demand out there. And I think one of the sectors that actually is going to face the most difficulty is actually my old sector of contract food service. I think contract food service, particularly because so much of its business essentially was based on, for instance, central London city centres, it is going to have a big rethink on what its business model is, what it has to offer, and maybe think of other ways of generating business, because what it actually has is a great body of skilled people, and it is very skilled at providing great food and service. So that's the transferable skill. Now it has to find where it can use that skill. More hospitals, maybe actually getting into care homes and improving food service in care homes, a whole range of areas, maybe delivered food to home. It's got to be a different model, and it's got to be a model that isn't just based on purchase volumes. I worry that maybe over the last 10, 15 years in contract food service, the business model has been the profitable business model has been almost entirely based on pushing up purchase volumes, retain discount, and that's where the profitability has come from. And it's lost contact with its customer bases, and of course it has two customer bases. It has the people it's actually feeding and the clients who actually give it permission to operate in their premises. It's got to reach out to both those customer bases to re-establish what its purpose is and the role it has to play and how it can offer great value and service and what its real expertise is, and get rewarded and paid for the genuine expertise it provides, not just get revenues based on purchase volumes.
Oh, look, as you know what I'm going to say as well, because we haven't enabled young talent either, have we?
Well, as I say, because we've been lazy in our recruitment, and the basis of a good company which wants to look to the long term is always getting great young talent in at the ground floor, and that young talent then gradually learns the job, grows its business, and works through the company. And I remember very clearly in my sort of Gardner Merchant Sodexo days, we regularly recruited 200, 300, 400 people from catering college every year and a number of graduates from university every year. And those were the bedrock of the business as we developed them. And if we had a year or two when we didn't recruit enough people for short-term reasons, lo and behold, 4 or 5 years later, we were able to see that hole, as it were, in the management development programs, i.e. we were short of people at district manager level or operations director level, i.e. every year you have to be recruiting good people from college or school to be on the ground floor. And you want the brightest and the best, not the also-rans. So those companies, that focus on getting the brightest and the best into their business on the ground floor, training and developing them properly, are the ones that will succeed into the long term.
Yeah. It's a change of thinking again, isn't it, that we need?
It is a change of thinking, but it's a fundamental one, because it's about getting the correct priorities in train. And there is nothing more important than recruiting the right people to begin with. So that they've got, you've got the right material to build on.
Yeah, no, I agree. Moving on slightly, because it's again connected, is about people's behaviours, social behaviours after this. Because actually the debate is that social distancing may well still be in place come September, October.
Well, that is what I'm saying. I think when one looks what I term for the long term, I think we are going to see social distancing with us for a very long time because of this threat of, sort of new strains of the pandemic potentially arising. And that means that if we're going to have to live with social distance in this way, working practices will have to change forever, but also potential volumes that one can turn over in a hotel or restaurant or whatever will be, considerably less for the foreseeable future. And that's why we have to reconstruct the business model based on these lower levels of turnover. But I assure you, I've always found it interesting that, if I look at a hotel, for example, outside London in rural regional areas, one can make a reasonable return on capital running a hotel at 60-odd% occupancy. Whereas central London, everyone used to sort of moan that they needed 85 to 90% occupancy. And of course, they got used to that level of occupancy over the last years, and rents and costs and everything else went up accordingly. I think people have to get back to being more realistic in terms of if the occupancy is going to be around 60%, that's what we have construct the business model based on. With restaurants, we're not going to have the same turnover volumes that we had in the past of turning tables over 3 times at lunchtime, 3 times in the evening, etc., etc. We're going to have to staff up accordingly. We're going to have perhaps simpler menus. The whole system has going to have to reflect the new turnover levels.
And how talking to your clients, how far do you think they've actually realised this now?
I think it is just. I think since Christmas there has been a sea change in that. This is the 3rd lockdown. Certainly, I think the new variants that have been, whether it's a South African variant or a Brazilian one or even a UK one, a realization that whilst broadly COVID is out and about, there is a chance of new variants coming to light. That means we're going to have to live with controls, as it were, on travel generally around the world. So that will that will reduce volumes to our sector, but also locally that, people are going to continue to want to, as it were, keep a 2-meter rule going, even if they've had the vaccination, because we're not yet certain how long the vaccination will last for. Does it have to be repeated? Will people need a new vaccination if there is a new variant comes on board? Whilst people will want to go back and use hotels and restaurants when they can, I think, in the psyche, people are going to be much more careful and want to keep social distancing. So I think that realization is there now, and it's the new variants and the realization that even with the vaccination program, people are going to have to live with potential pandemics for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely. I mean, one of the interesting conversations we had last week in an event was someone from the city noted that, people may well start recruiting. If you're working virtually, people start recruiting internationally with cheaper people rather than local people as well.
I personally don't see that in the foreseeable future because of the travel restrictions and, I see the government's talking about sort of opening up potentially hotels for people to be housed at some cost for anyone who enters the country. I think, when one looks at, the New Zealand model or the Australia model or those countries where there's been an extreme restriction on what I term people entering the country, that is the model they're working on. So I think the idea that we are going to go back to having, movement of labor coming into this country on a relatively easy basis is not something that's going to happen. I think we will be bringing people into the country perhaps for frontline services like in the NHS, but I don't see that particularly in hospitality.
And how about leadership? Because leadership's going to change as a result of all this as well, isn't it? Because how we have to engage is going to be key as well, isn't it?
Well, I would like to think that, in some way, leadership always emerges. You'd like to think that people come to the fore by force of circumstance almost, because there are always, sort of leaders in groups of people and society and sectors. But I think it is going to have to be a new enlightened leadership. It's going to have to one that is very open to innovation and new ideas. It's also going to have to be one that accepts that, workforces are going to have to be handled with care because, if you're in a frontline job anyway or you're in contact with people, there may be certain risks involved, so that you're actually going to have to handle your workforces with a degree of sensitivity and give them all the practical and emotional support you can. So, that requires a different type of leadership than perhaps one in the past.
There's also communication, which is obviously one of your great skills. It's how we communicate is going to happen.
Well, communications too has always been fundamental to good leadership, whether it's face-to-face communication or whether now we can use social media to a much greater extent to help in communication, because it is just a tool. But I think what it will mean is more and more communication is the actual fundamental, whether it's communication with customers and potential customers, communication with your staff, communication, quite frankly, with society and the wider world. People are going to have to be able to explain what they're doing and why, and be able to win hearts and minds, which, in essence, to me, has always been the central skill of great leadership, is the ability to win people's hearts and minds, not to tell them what to do. You might be right in what it is you want to do, but you have to be able to win people's hearts and minds on a broad basis. And that's the fundamental skill that I think we want to re-emphasize, that great leadership is about people being able to win hearts and minds of their fellow human being, whether in the workplace, whether as customers, whether as suppliers, or whether as society as a whole.
So coming out of all this is that there's quite a lot of positives that can come out, isn't there? Even though we've got to go through a massive change in how we look at models.
Well, I think if one looks back in history at traumatic events, whether, more recently the 3-day week on the industrial front, or the Second World War, or the First World War, or one can go back into the 19th century with 1848, etc., etc. When there have been traumatic events either in a country or globally, those traumatic events force through change, and they force through change by being a fundamental impact on the human psyche, and that is what I think we will see at the moment. We will look back and see 2019, 2020, 2021 was a time of a fundamental change on the human psyche in terms of what business was about, what society was about, the role everyone has to play in it, how we can help each other, but also, how we can survive and come through, because human beings, if nothing else, have extraordinary ingenuity and the ability to adapt and change, and that's what makes human beings the successful people they are compared to, shall we say, other animal species. It's our ability to adapt and change to change circumstances. So we will come through this. It'll be a very, very different place, and we will look back on these 2 or 3 years as being one of those fundamental shifts where things changed, and hopefully we will look back and think, yes, it was in many ways a positive change, albeit it was done in a fairly dramatic way, and there were a lot of heartfelt suffering on the way.
All very fair. Bob, look, thanks very much for those thoughts again today. It's been
Thank you, Chris. It's always enjoyable talking, and as I say, I think they make an interesting timeline as to the way our thinking process has been over the last 12 months, and I'm sure it'll continue to evolve as well.
Well, I think this month has been particularly challenging for people, because I think people came back with one vision on the beginning of January, and they're finishing the month with a very different picture. So I think it's
well, that's right, and I think there's probably still some change to go, but hopefully, shall we say, by Easter, we might be in a better place.
Let's hope. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, good to speak to you, Chris.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.